Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Bible Study at Central Hall, whether you're here in the church parlour at Central Hall or whether you're watching us online. It's really good to have you with us today. We're working our way through part of Matthew's Gospel, and we find ourselves today in Matthew chapter 9, and we're going to start reading in verse 35, continuing into chapter 10 and the first 4 verses. And if you're using the Bibles here, that's on page 974. For those who are joining us online, I'm reading from the New International Version. So Matthew 9, starting at verse 35. Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom and healing every disease and sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them, because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field." He called his 12 disciples to him and gave them authority to drive out evil spirits and to heal every disease and sickness. These are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, who's also called Peter, and his brother Andrew. James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. Philip and Bartholomew. Thomas and Matthew, the tax collector. James, son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus. Simon the zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. So if you can remember, those of you that were here, where Gareth kind of finished last week, Jesus is at this time and point in his ministry based in Capernaum. That was the centre of his ministry, where most likely he spent most nights. And as we read here, Matthew tells us that Jesus had been going throughout all the towns and villages, teaching in the synagogue, preaching good news, healing diseases and sickness. And we read here that Jesus was moved with compassion for the crowds. And we read that he was moved because they were like sheep without a shepherd, harassed and helpless. And I believe Jesus still looks on people in the same way, that he still has compassion. And throughout the Old Testament, you hear this description of God when it says, the Lord is merciful and compassionate, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. That's the God that we read of in the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament. And this is the God that we see in and through the life of Jesus here. So Jesus was going around teaching in their synagogues. Those of you, and I know some of you have, who have been to Capernaum, will know that it's right on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And as you walk around the shore, which you can walk the circumference of the Sea of Galilee, if you should want to. It's quite a long way. I think the circumference is 33 kilometres. So what's that, about 22 or 23 miles probably. It would be a long day's walk if you wanted to do that. But you could do it. I've driven around it. That's far easier, but that wasn't an option for Jesus. But as you would walk around, particularly near to Capernaum, you come to lots of kind of little villages and what is now kind of archaeological areas of interest. And when I was on the Sea of Galilee just a couple of months ago, and we went to Magdala. You know where Mary was from, Mary of Magdalene. And they've uncovered there, it's the most amazing sight. And they've uncovered a first century synagogue. And so when I read this, and it says that Jesus went through all the towns and villages teaching in their synagogues, that wouldn't have been just Capernaum. Magdala would be maybe a half an hour walk from Capernaum. And as I said, they've just uncovered this first century synagogue. This has been uncovered in the last 5 or so years, so it's very fresh, it's very new. And the archaeologists are saying it's the best example of a first century synagogue that they're yet to uncover. And there may be more that they find. It's quite an astounding thing to see there. And that would have been, when I was there and with Samir, who was our local guide, he said with absolute certainty, this is a synagogue where Jesus would have taught. And you can see they're still digging, but you can see the walls to it. You can see a particular rock that they've uncovered, which would have been where the scroll of the Torah would have been laid. And this is where Jesus was. It was around this area of Capernaum. And we read that Jesus was preaching and teaching, healing diseases and sickness, yet he had compassion on the people that he saw because he realized that they were lacking in shepherding. He uses a lot this image of sheep and shepherds. They were lacking in shepherding, which for the Pharisees, who would have been within earshot of what Jesus is saying, he's not directly doing this, but as they listen, that was their job as the religious leaders to look after the people. Yet Jesus is saying they're like sheep without shepherds. The final verse of last week's study is a quote from the Pharisees. Matthew says, but the Pharisee says, it is by the prince of demons that he, that's Jesus, drives out demons. It's quite a harsh thing, a criticism to be laid at someone, saying that Jesus was demon possessed. And it's kind of made me think, as I was preparing for today, that when I or when any of you receive criticism, that's something that we find hard often to shake off. It kind of sticks with us, doesn't it? If you have 100 comments about something and 99 of them are positive and one's not, you hold on to the one that's not, don't you? It just is the way that it is. Yet Jesus here, in response to this criticism, as we kind of launch our verses for today, we read that Jesus went around the towns and synagogues, teaching and preaching the good news, healing every sickness and disease. He doesn't seem to be, as we often are, swayed by this criticism. Yet what he is moved with compassion. The commentator William Barclay describes this compassion as the type of compassion that moves a man or a woman to the deepest depths of their being. The word, I'm not going to try and say it because I won't be able to. I've got it written down here. I've got no idea how to say this. But the word in Greek that is translated into compassion is the strongest word that they could find, and to kind of describe the emotion that Jesus has, that we have here as compassion. Spurgeon, in his commentary that I was reading, says that the word is not even found in classic Greek. The fact is, it was a word coined by the evangelists themselves, as they could not find one in the whole Greek language that suited their purpose, and therefore they made one up. So this compassion that Jesus feels is not like a sympathy or an empathy for people. He was moved very deeply by the fact that these crowds that were following after him had been terribly let down by the religious leaders of the day. And so we read that they were scattered like sheep without a shepherd. So what we see here are two pictures. We get a picture of a neglected flock of sheep, and then we get the picture of a harvest going to waste because of a lack of reapers or labourers or farmers, however we want to put it. Both here imply a very kind of pitiful plight of the people that Jesus has gathered around him. Harassed and helpless. So we get this picture of a pitiful group of people, but also a neglect of duty on the part of their religious leaders. We have no shepherds, but we have a need for labourers. Jesus says, and this is a phrase that most of you will be very familiar with because you've probably heard people preach on it. This phrase, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. It's often a line used when people are trying to appeal for help or volunteers. It's wrongly used in that respect, I think, because that's a bit of a guilt trip, really, isn't it? When we need help on things. And so, but you would have heard that the harvest is plentiful. You look out at our city centre and you just see there's a plentiful harvest there. There are people everywhere, but the labourers are few. And a plentiful harvest is no good if there are no workers to pick what's being harvested. I'm at a risk of making a political statement, so I don't want to do that. But it's really sad to see fields full of fruit and vegetable yet not picked because there aren't pickers to pick it. I think Cornwall in particular has been blighted with this. That the harvest may be ripe and plentiful, but fruit is going rotten. So a plentiful harvest with no labourers, what that leaves you with is just rotten fruit. And so Jesus says, pray for labourers. We're told here by Jesus to pray and ask the Lord of the harvest to send out workers. And when I was last here teaching a few weeks ago, we were at the end of Matthew chapter 8, and we looked at the time when Jesus commanded demons to leave two possessed men. You'll remember the story. It's when Jesus crosses over the River Galilee from Capernaum, and he arrives at the region of the Gadarenes, I think it is, and two demon-possessed men walk out of a tomb, and Jesus commands the demons to leave them. If you remember, they went into the herd of pigs. The herd of pigs go over the cliff and into the sea. And you read in chapter 8, verse 31 of that, it says, the demons begged Jesus, if you drive us out, send us into the herd of pigs. The demons speak and say, if you drive us out. Now, I wonder what sort of image you currently have in your mind of that particular process, or what the demons are saying. They're saying, if you drive us out. Now, to me, the kind of things that I think of seem quite forceful and quite a dramatic thing. Demons say, if you drive us out. We go on in a few verses. Jesus calls the 12 disciples. He gives them authority to drive out evil spirits. Now, why I'm telling you this, or just focusing on this for a moment, is the words that are used in the language that we translate into English, the words that are originally used here to talk about driving out of demons, is the same word used when Jesus says, ask the Lord to send out workers into the harvest. Now, as I look at those two different things, and I look at the driving out of a demon from somebody to bring freedom from captivity to that person, and then workers sent out into the harvest, one is more forceful than the other in my mind, yet it's the same word that's used here. So I think what Jesus is saying here, or what we can glean from this, is that when Jesus says, send out workers, this is something that's accompanied with power and authority. This is more than just a gentle notice or nudge in the church notices asking for volunteers for a fun day or a MWIB lunch or something. Jesus is saying, I'm sending you out. And the prayer that Jesus is saying to the disciples, ask the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into his harvest field, is a prayer that we still need to be praying. And it's a prayer that I would encourage us all to pray earnestly. But as you pray it, we can only pray this sort of prayer honestly and with integrity if, as we pray, we also have an ear open to God perhaps telling us to go into the harvest too. Jesus says, ask the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into his harvest field. And then, to the very same disciples that he says, pray this, he sends them. So it's as if they had prayed it, the prayer is answered, and it's like, go. Now, you may notice, if ever you go to, I've noticed this with Gareth and other leaders who are quite wise, if you go to them and say things like, be careful, you might watch this, so be careful what I say. If you say things like, I've got a great idea for something, there's a wonderful opportunity to do this, then the smart people who hear that sort of thing would say, okay, go for it. You know, when sometimes what you're saying is, I got a great idea. Now, let's think of some people who could maybe do that. You know, what we get here from Jesus is a kind of an example of that. You know, he's saying to the disciples, ask the Lord to send out workers into his harvest field. And Jesus then sends them. We go into chapter 10 and we see some of these workers and some of these labourers. And what a list it is. Now, if you're like me, when you read the Bible, and I've just been asked actually by Scripture Union to write some notes I write for their Bible study series, or one of their Bible study daily reading notes. And I've just been asked to write some more notes for June 2025. They're very well organised, you know. And so I have a year to write these notes roughly. They'll be submitted by May 2024 for publication in June 2025. And I was looking at the bit of the Bible and they've given me, I've got 2 days in those notes where I've got to write notes on a list of names. Because I'm doing Genesis 1 to 11. And there's 2 bits of it that is just, here's a list of names from Adam to whoever. And I've got to write Bible study notes on them. So if you're like me, when you read this kind of list, you sometimes skip through this because it's just a list of names. Well, here is a kind of a special list. These are 12 people, incredibly diverse in background, that Jesus chooses. He doesn't choose the kind of elite Bible scholar Jewish boys. These are fishermen and the brothers of fishermen. And Matthew, interestingly, gives us a bit more information on specifically two of them in the list. And I'm kind of going to come to a close with just a little bit of reflection on that. The two that he gives most information on, and it's not a lot here, but one of them is himself. So he says Matthew, this is in verse 3. So we get Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew, the tax collector. Okay, this is also Matthew, the writer of the gospel. But he refers to himself and he refers to some more information. He said, well, then Matthew, he was a tax collector. We also hear, we don't know much about him elsewhere, but we hear of Simon the Zealot. Now, I find it fascinating that Matthew doesn't say James the fisherman or Thomas, who would later doubt him, or Thaddeus, who we don't know anything else about, don't get mentioned anywhere else. But he does say Matthew the tax collector and Simon the Zealot. Nobody, and hear this with the heart that I'm saying it, nobody in their right mind, I'm not saying Jesus wasn't in his right mind, but nobody would come up with a list of people to be in your inner group, your closest 12, that would have a zealot and a tax collector in the same team. Now, a zealot was somebody who was passionate about overthrowing the Roman occupying force. So you might have heard of zealots. They're kind of really passionate. At this time, the zealots would have been aggressively against the Roman occupation. A tax collector was one who would collect taxes from the Jewish people for the Roman occupiers. So he was, for want of a better phrase, kind of in bed with the Romans, the tax collectors. It's why they were hated. You wouldn't put together 12 people unless you had another agenda with a zealot and a tax collector in the same team. It's not a stretch to assume that the zealot would have wanted to kill the tax collector. This would have made for very interesting times of discussion around the fire pit on the Sea of Galilee. Imagine it. We read that sometimes the disciples had different ideas on things. We read sometimes of how there was issues with the treasurer of the group, Judas, whose interest was in money. We don't read too much about the zealot and the tax collector. It's on my list of things I want to find out. How do they get on together? But what it does tell us is that Jesus, when we're knelt in front of Jesus, everything becomes equal. And in his sight, he doesn't care whether one is a zealot, wanting to overthrow the Roman occupation, the other is a tax collector, albeit he left that to follow Jesus, if you remember, but that was his background. And then amongst them, we've got fishermen, and we've got Judas, who would later betray Jesus. He would have known that. You've got Peter, who would later deny him, yet Jesus draws them all together. And not only does he call them all together, but he sends them out, drives them out with power and authority. Note that Matthew refers to these 12 in verse 1 of chapter 10 as 12 disciples. We get to verse 2 and he says, and these are the name of the 12 apostles. So in one verse he refers to them as disciples. The next verse he refers to them as apostles. Now a disciple is one who follows, whereas an apostle is one who is sent. And these 12 fit both descriptions. They are ones who are called, and then they're ones who are sent. Jesus has mentioned sending out workers into the harvest, and here he is doing it. So the process seemed to be then that individuals are called to follow and are drawn to Christ. They then receive power from him, and then they are sent out into the world. The model hasn't changed. Christ is still in the business of calling, whether you're a zealot, whether you're a tax collector, whether you're a fisherman or whatever. But he's still also in the business of saying, call on me and I will send out workers into the field. And when you call on me, then it's you that I'll send. And he's still doing that now. Amen.